Welcome to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. We bring you news and analysis from the front lines of the global struggle for social and economic justice. I'm your host, Brianna Griffith, and here's what's going down in your backyard and across the world. This week, we are celebrating International Migrants Day, which has been declared by the United Nations for December 18th. I would like to talk about some of the issues regarding migration, the militarization of the border, specifically kind of U.S. borders and whatnot, and, you know, generally like what is being done around kind of social and economic justice to prevent some of the true horrors that are happening because of the militarization of this border. To talk about all this, we are joined now by Paige Corich-Kleim, who is the media coordinator of No More Deaths and also active in No More Deaths desert aid work. Thank you very much, Paige, for joining the show.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
So I guess we can start by talking a little bit about what is No More Deaths, kind of the types of work you do, and how essentially the organization came to be, because I think it's a very interesting organization that does very useful work.
Absolutely. So we were founded in 2004 as a response to an increase in deaths along the U.S. Mexico border. Those deaths really started as a result of the U.S. policy of prevention through deterrence, which militarized certain areas of the border in an attempt to funnel people into more dangerous areas to try to prevent people from crossing the border. So it was really intentionally using death and suffering to police the borderlands. So we started in 2004 as a more steady 24-hour presence in the desert. We're mostly known for putting out water, but we also document abuses on the part of Border Patrol and the state. And we also do search and rescue and search and recovery, as well as support for people in northern Mexico who have already been deported or who are considering crossing the desert.
I'd like to talk briefly about specifically the Scott Warren case that made national news because of the desert aid, because of the water that he was putting out. Can you, for those who might not be familiar, just recap what that case was all about and why it became a nationally covered story?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Scott Warren case is interesting because there actually were two separate cases that Scott was connected to. So one that I think got more coverage was the felony where he was charged with harboring for, in the words of the government, providing food, water, clothing, and beds to two men from Central America named Jose and Christian. So he was charged with harboring and was taken to trial in June. And that resulted in a hung jury. It was split 8-4, 8 for acquittal, 4 for a guilty. And they retried him in November, and we just a couple of weeks ago got a not guilty verdict from that. So he's been completely acquitted of those charges. But he also was facing charges that were at a misdemeanor level for leaving food and water in the desert in one of the most deadly corridors that's referred to as the Trail of Death on the Cabeza Prieta National Wildlife Refuge. And he actually had it wasn't a jury trial, it was a bench trial, and he had that trial before the felony. But because of the how high profile the case was, the judge decided to not issue a verdict until the felony case was resolved. So we just got a verdict as well for that case, actually right after the felony verdict came through. And he was found guilty of driving in a wilderness area, but the government actually dropped a charge of abandonment of property based on a religious freedoms claim. So his lawyers argued under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act that the act of leaving water for Scott is part of his religious and spiritual practice and therefore is protected. And the judge agreed and actually dropped that charge. So in some ways, that decision is actually more historic than the acquittal on the felony charges. It was a bit overshadowed. But in general, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, or RFRA, is mostly used by kind of the Christian conservative right. And what's interesting about Scott is he doesn't identify with any of the kind of predominant denominations. He doesn't identify as a Christian, but his actions were still protected. So we're kind of figuring out what that means because, you know, often religious freedoms actually end up when they're enforced, violate the rights of other people. And that's, I think we're, as a group, for the collective liberation of all people. And so it's kind of this tricky thing, but is potentially going to provide protection for our work in the future.
So you think that establishes enough of a precedent that that it really can kind of change the game as to how aid is provided to migrants, to people who are coming here from the border?
I don't know that it's not necessarily precedent setting, but it is historic and does provide a model for future protections. But it's not a protection for anybody to leave water in the desert right now. It's like very specific to Scott. And then we're also we had 8 other volunteers that were facing similar charges. 4 of them ended up just getting charged with a civil infraction and paying a fine. But 4 additional volunteers were found guilty and were appealing that. And they also had a RFRA defense that was not considered by the judge. And so this RFRA win with Scott, we're also using to appeal other guilty verdicts. So, we're hoping to try to figure out ways to expand it, but there's a lot of other questions that we have and ways that we're trying to figure that out. So it's a possibility. It's not like a definitive right now it's all protected, but it did open a really big door for protections of our work, which is exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. And how has sort of the coverage of this incident kind of affected your work generally?
I think it's been complicated. I mean, I think running a legal defense campaign is a lot of work, and I think it ended up being a lot more work than any of us really wanted to do. I think most of us came to No More Deaths because we want to be in the field and we want to be providing direct aid, and the legal defense campaign really pulled some of us out of the field. I can speak for myself, and I came out here to carry water into the desert and to provide direct aid, and I've kind of had to shift my focus to more of a media role. And that's useful, but it does feel it's draining sometimes, and it's a lot less grounding of work. But that being said, I think the coverage has brought in a lot more resources, and we've been able to expand our work as well, which is exciting. Because I think the point of the charges was partially to kind of target our organization, and was part of the expansion of targeting of migrant justice activists and also undocumented folks. And so us being able to kind of turn that on its head and use the influx of resources to actually double down on our work was really, I think that's a pretty powerful thing that we've been able to do.
We see these kind of highly visible people, and they often kind of are more of a stand-in for what's actually kind of a larger struggle between different groups, different coalitions, different organizations. So, for instance, to use an example, not necessarily comparing Scott to a Rosa Parks, but when you think of Rosa Parks, she wasn't just a woman who sat on a bus. She had a coalition behind her that sort of backed that up. And so to understand that often people from organizations might be targeted, as you're talking about, to prevent the work that it is they're doing, to kind of send a chilling effect to say, if you work with this organization, or if you do this kind of work, we will come after you, which is what I think the charges against Scott were absolutely about in this case. But then at the same time, I think the visibility that comes from that and the absurdity of a case like that going to trial, to be tried for leaving water in the desert for people, that also kind of has a powerful impact in sort of exposing, I think, the absolute ridiculous nature, the absolute, kind of, I would call it proto-fascism for sure, of the kind of U.S. state in all of this. Do you kind of see it that way, or?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I think the targeting of Scott, they kind of wanted to make an example of him. And I think what actually came out of it was people across the political spectrum actually looked at that case and thought it was ridiculous. We got one full jury, 12 people, to say, no, this isn't a crime. And on the other side, we had the 8-4 decision. And I think just the way that this case has gotten so much attention, I think I'm sure it has scared certain border residents that have been giving aid. I think an important thing to mention is that us as No More Deaths, we absolutely did not invent humanitarian aid. We have been doing it in kind of this more above board organizational style, but people in the borderlands have been giving care and aid to people that have been knocking on their doors for decades. And so, I think a thing that we're excited about with this win is that it really affirms that that's not a crime, and that people, and not just that it's not a crime, but that there's really, really widespread public support for that. And that, the government has been using this strategy of death and suffering, but actually most people don't think that people should die crossing the border. I think one kind of interesting thing that came up in court was that the prosecutors put in a motion that Scott and his lawyers could not mention Donald Trump or his policies or his administration in court. Yeah. And it just really, I think it just pointed to the political aspect of this trial and just the way that we've really used it to shine light on the fact that this is the government's fault and it is their responsibility. And at the end of the day, we don't want to exist as an organization. We're completely responsive to a crisis that's created by them. And so by targeting us, they're actually giving us a platform to shine the light back on them and really expose what they're doing. And what they're doing is really ugly and it's embarrassing, honestly. And so I think we did do an effective job at uncovering some of that. And it definitely goes beyond Trump. I mean, the prevention through deterrence policy has been in place since the Clinton administration. And so we don't want to just limit it and say Trump is the only problem, because both Democrats and Republicans have done horrendous things to the immigrant community. But it just really highlighted the absurdity of all of it.
Yeah, I think that's very important to point out that really the border militarization has been a bipartisan project. It's had mostly kind of consensus support since the very beginning. And in fact, I think a lot of the kind of current border militarization within the U.S. actually dates back to around the time of NAFTA. It was the Clinton administration that at the kind of passage of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, that essentially allowed, in many ways, the free flow of capital that depressed wages on both sides of the border. The Clinton administration was also, at the same time, obviously with the consultation of the kind of what we would call the military-industrial complex, was also planning essentially a large kind of border militarization, an increase in I'm forgetting the precursor to ICE, INS rather, and an increase in border patrol to kind of correspond to that, because they knew that the economic impact that it was going to have on both sides of the border was going to cause a lot of people to essentially flee the new impoverishment that they were going to be facing. And so that became a pretense for increasing that border militarization. It became a pretense for, essentially trying to invoke this kind of racism to pit workers against each other when everybody was suffering in such a way that we're still seeing kind of the ripple effects of that. But I think, with some of the social and economic development since then, I think we're seeing kind of a renewed solidarity across borders, or at least I hope a renewed solidarity across borders between kind of workers and oppressed peoples of all stripes. I'm wondering, is that kind of a political analysis something that people in No More Deaths are kind of engaging with as well? Or the other part of that I'd like to ask about is sort of like how No More Deaths sort of engages with the communities out there in Arizona to kind of bring people around to this humanitarian side.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it kind of depends on who we're talking to. I think a lot of us kind of do have that kind of wider analysis of looking at push factors and U.S. intervention in Latin America and, the global kind of increase in border policing and not just border policing, but also profiteering off of that. Because a lot of the people that are getting these contracts to build the border wall and to detain people, it's all private contracts. So there's this really huge profit motive there as well. But I think there's kind of two sides of it of like, yeah, I think we have a lot of our long-term people have kind of this more holistic analysis of what's happening. But I think we also, in working in rural border communities, kind of just meet people where they're at. And, our mission at the end of the day is to end death and suffering. And when you approach it from that sense, I think even if you don't agree with somebody politically, I think our goal is to get individuals to provide food and water to others and challenge the idea that it should be a death sentence to cross the border. So, I think we are able to speak that kind of analysis language, and then also kind of look at who our audience is and who we're trying to move and meet them there, and just really, really boil it down to, because it is actually a pretty simple issue. People shouldn't be dying on the border, and that's that's kind of the root of it.
Yeah, if you're just tuning in, you are listening to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. We broadcast on 91.7 FM in Austin and are also syndicated on WHIV 102.3 FM New Orleans. We are talking with Paige Corich-Kleim, who's the media coordinator of No More Deaths and also an active volunteer in No More Deaths desert aid work for some years, about, first of all, a celebration of International Migrants Day, but then also about the work that No More Deaths has done. I'm wondering, since you have, or since the organization has been active since 2004, what sort of have the major trends in border militarization been? What have you seen kind of upticks at certain points? For instance, after the 2009 coup in Honduras, or is it an administrative thing? Is it a change in geopolitical situations, or is it just sort of a steady kind of year after year increase in sort of that militarized atmosphere, even if the construction itself may not see that increase?
I think it's kind of more just been a steady increase. From what I've seen, I've been around since about 2013 and have a lot of close friends who have been around since more like 2007, 2008. And I think what we've mostly seen is just a lot of the places where we do put water have become a lot more remote. So we often we'll go and map migrant trails, kind of looking for trash and different signs, or looking at maps of known migrant deaths. And we'll go put water in those places. And a lot of our drops used to be really centralized around the town of Arivaca, which is a small town south of Tucson. And we would just have drops that were water drops, or what we refer to the places that we leave water, food, and blankets and socks and just different aid supplies. But a lot of them used to be like within a quarter mile of roads. And so we'd just drive a road and then kind of hop out, drop some supplies and keep driving. But now we've really had to go further into the mountains. And so we did a big analysis of all of our water drops a couple of years ago, and that's what resulted in a report about interference with humanitarian aid that also had an associated video of Border Patrol destroying water that eventually led to Scott's arrest in retaliation. But one thing that didn't really get widely spread that was part of that report was just showing how much more remote our drops had gotten over the years. So instead of hiking like a quarter mile off the road, we're going 2 miles, 4 miles. We're hiking up to a ridge line, going up 1,400 feet of elevation gain while carrying these heavy supplies. And so we've seen an increase in the construction of walls and also enforcement in the areas that are easier to walk in, which funnels people into some of the most remote areas. In the Ajo corridor, which we started expanding to in 2014, there's about 80 miles and that's just a direct line from the border to the next paved road that people are crossing. And that includes walking across about 20 miles of an active bombing range. So when we talk about border militarization, it's not just a metaphor. It's people literally walking through a zone that is having bombs dropped on it. And that's intentional, and that the shift of people moving in the Ajo corridor we've seen over the past 5 or 6 years.
Yeah, I'm wondering also like how the organization has kind of evolved to meet some of these new routes, like what sort of tactics the organization has had to kind of shift in order to, essentially keep pace with this increasing militarization.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what a lot of the misdemeanor charges stem from. It was from our increase in putting water on the Cabeza Prieta National Wildlife Refuge, which is like the last public access area before the bombing range, because that whole range, there's no public access. So, I think our response in the winter of 2016, we really increased our presence out in the Ajo corridor. And that resulted in us running like a volunteer program that was just based out there. Most of the time we're based in Arivaca. And within the first week of that program, volunteers found 5 different sets of human remains. And so that really led us to kind of double down and really commit to putting water out there and learning about that area and figuring out how we can intervene in it. And then that summer is when people started getting charges for that work. So I think it's this tricky thing where we identified a problem, tried to start responding to it, and then pretty instantly got pushback from the government. So we're, and I think when we were talking about putting water out there, we were like, okay, like what are the potential outcomes? And we're like, well, no matter what, like we get to talk about what's happening out here and we get to shine a light on it, and that feels important. And so we've been able to do that, but we've also been somewhat limited in what we've been able to do to intervene because of the threat of arrests and the threat of tickets and stuff like that. It really can have a chilling effect on people.
And that's kind of what you've noticed within the community as well, the different communities you work with in Arizona, is that chilling effect, or?
I think for leaving food and water, I think it somewhat has had that. I mean, I think there definitely are people who are still continuing to put out water no matter what and are really driven and committed to that. But I think, I can speak for myself, and I was banned from the refuge for a year, and then through a FOIA request found out that the refuge had written essentially a template letter to me that was never sent, but basically saying that I was going to be charged with, question mark for my actions on question mark. They'd kind of pre-written this letter. And, I think the threat of not being able to go back out there and do search and rescue and search and recovery for me felt really real. And so I kind of had to think about what I wanted to do and how I wanted to interact with that land. And, it's hard. It's like, I can go search for people who are missing or find people's bodies out there, but I can't put out the supplies that I know that will prevent people from becoming lost and dying. And so it's this really deep irony, where also they're weaponizing conservation law against us while also bulldozing Saguaro to build the border wall. So there's these really deep, upsetting things. And I think on top of it all, it's all on native land. Like it's all Tanatam, Hyacharatam land, that's been stolen and destroyed, and then called wilderness. It's just, there's so many deep ironies that are hard, but, the work is continuing and people are still out there and we're intervening in the ways that we can.
Yeah, thank you for bringing up that last point about the indigenous land. I think that's very important, is that so much of all of these borders really are completely artificial. Even the fact that Texas within the United States is itself a product of land theft and whatnot, and really all of all of the Southwest for sure. But indigenous peoples never really intended, and were somehow never really intended for these kind of borders to be set up. Never lived in that sort of way. Even land ownership was such a kind of foreign concept, because so much of land was kind of communally owned for the common good in a way that has since been privatized. And even kind of the National Park Service and whatnot, you can trace that back to essentially a product of kind of securing land theft from indigenous peoples. I mean, sure, it seems for sure, and I'm not saying we shouldn't have a system of kind of wildlife preservation for sure, but the history of that within the United States is more involved in that essentially securing U.S. control over indigenous sovereign land than it is actually preservation of anything. Obviously, as we've seen with the Trump administration's attack on all sorts of regulation, environmental regulation included, the Trump administration is not particularly worried about about conservation of anything. But I guess here we are with that. Here we are with the fact that they'll use kind of any pretense they can. I also think it's incredible. You were saying that they had a template written out for you that just had question marks where they were going to, whatever it was they were going to charge you with, they just were waiting for you to come in and do a thing like leave a water drop or whatnot. And whatever it was, they had that template pre-written in order for them to expel you and charge you on that. That seems like an incredibly aggressive tactic to use against a single person.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was kind of it was just I mean, I had to just kind of laugh it off because it just felt so absurd. But yeah, no, it's there's a lot of things out there. I think when we were initially looking at working out there as well and kind of like reading through the Wilderness Act and being like, okay, where's the wiggle room? I mean, I just remember reading the part of it where, you know, establishing wilderness is to recognize a place where there's no presence of man or whatever. And it again just felt like this deep irony because there's just always been people on that land and there's always been people migrating through there. It's like a very well-known O'odham like corridor. Like some of the trails that people are walking on now are the same trails people have been using since time immemorial. And then also the wilderness area used to be part of the bombing range. So there's literal missile heads just kind of scattered throughout it.
Wow.
Which is like some of the successful searches that we've been on. It's been because, you know, it's a big, flat, pretty desolate area. And so the only points of reference are these missiles. And so I remember there was a case where a group of migrants walked by somebody who had died, and then they reported it to another search and recovery group. And then we ended up sending a group out to look for them. And we found this missile head, and that was like the way that we found the area that this person had died in. And we didn't actually find the person's body, which was upsetting, but it just, you know, it just really illustrated the deep irony of that land.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess we have a few minutes left. I just want to remind people that we're speaking with Paige Corich-Kleim of No More Deaths. You can find the website at nomoredeaths.org, where you can find different ways to get involved. No More Deaths is based in Arizona, but obviously came to a national prominence for the case against Scott Warren for essentially providing shelter to migrants and for leaving water bottles in the desert and in these kind of secluded areas where people were passing through. Is there anything else you'd like to kind of add in our last minute or two, just sort of either about your organization or just generally the work you're doing?
Yeah, I think we're not the only ones out there. There's the Samaritans in Tucson, Green Valley, and Ajo. There's also a lot of really amazing search and recovery groups that are solely dedicated to looking for people who have died. A lot of those are California based. There's the Armadillos del Desierto and Águilas del Desierto. And so I just wanted to recognize that there's a lot of people doing a lot of work out here. And then also just the residents every day that are providing people with the basic necessities for life when they come knocking on their door. Just shout out to all them. And yeah, there's a lot of people working on this.
Even as the border has become increasingly militarized, we've also seen that corresponding increase in the number of people who recognize not only the militarized border, but just the fact these borders at all to be such an arbitrary and in many ways oppressive thing, especially when you have, for instance, this, as we mentioned earlier, this free flow of capital, and yet the flow of people between these borders is so restricted when the capital itself, when wealth can flow so freely from usually in one direction from Mexico to the U.S. or from these kind of neo-colonies into the U.S. It just highlights the injustice even that much greater. But yeah, I think we're going to have to wrap it up there. We were joined by Paige Corich-Kleim, who is the media coordinator of No More Deaths. Thank you very much, Paige, for coming on the show. Yeah,
thank you so much for having me.
You are listening to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. People's Republic originates on KOOP 91.7 FM Austin and is also broadcast on WHIV 102.3 FM New Orleans. We are available as a podcast on Spreaker, Spotify, Stitcher, iTunes, or wherever podcasts are podded. Stay tuned. So now we are going to cover the coup in Bolivia that took place slightly earlier this year. As I mentioned before, I didn't really want to cover it until it was clear what was going on the ground. And now kind of in our current situation, I'm recording this on December 17th. It seems clear who is behind it, what it is that's going on, and basically what it is the coup plotters hoped to gain from this. So to talk about all this, we are joined now by Danny Shaw. Danny Shaw is a professor of Latin American and Caribbean Studies at the City University of New York. Thank you very much, Danny, for coming on.
An honor to be here.
Yeah, glad to have you for sure. So if you can just give us a basic kind of rundown, the media, so much of the U.S. corporate media has refused to even call this thing a coup. They have been referring to the government of Janine Áñez, which took power after the police and military brutally repressed indigenous movements. The U.S. media has called that government a quote unquote caretaker government, and of course has been very concerned about the so-called quote-unquote authoritarianism, or however else they'd like to phrase that, of the Morales government, while being completely blind to the serious human rights abuses and violation of both a Bolivian constitutional law as well as just the international norms of the current Bolivian, the quote unquote caretaker government, that is the coup government. So yeah, what is it exactly that happens generally in Bolivia?
Yeah, I think a caretaker government, a caretaker for neoliberalism, for U.S. aid to come back in, and the International Monetary Fund, and to bring Bolivia back into the orbit of U.S. capital and the United States' junior partners, the European Union, and the usual cast of characters. So the golpistas, the leaders of this coup, Áñez and Camacho and Mesa, and the rest of their entourage, they have a long history of anti-indigenous, very right-wing activities. Camacho comes out of this neo-fascist, these Christian nationalist groups. So there's this deep historical, racial, and class divide in Bolivia, and we see the increasing polarization of the country. And when a population that's 80 to 90% indigenous and mestizo, the official statistics are 64%, but anyone who's been to Bolivia knows it's much higher than that. And that Áñez and Camacho, they represent the other Bolivia. And when the indigenous have come into the streets, saying that Evo is not alone and they want their president back, the repression has been very severe. Dozens have been killed and hundreds upon hundreds of arrests and injured. So that struggle is ongoing.
It truly is a white supremacist coup in every sense. When Camacho first took to the palace in the first hours of the military coup, Camacho came to the palace with a cartoonishly oversized Bible and said that Pachamama is no longer welcome here. That is the one of the indigenous goddesses, and basically was saying that indigenous people and their religion are no longer welcome in Bolivia. At the same time, you have videos coming out of Bolivia. This is in the first hours and first days of the coup, where the police were tearing the indigenous flags out of their uniform. The indigenous flags that become a symbol of Bolivia as a plurinational state were being ripped from their uniforms, and the police were saying, we're the police. We don't take any crap. When I talk about fascism, I mean it for a very particular set of events, or a very particular social class within capitalism, a very particular movement within capitalism, and especially the movement behind Camacho is absolutely fascist in nature. You can find propaganda videos of them Sieg Heiling, among other kind of white supremacist rhetoric that they're putting out. And I think that's important to note, that when we're talking about fascism here, we're talking about literal fascists. We're not using that term hyperbolically. In next week's episode, we talk a whole lot with members of About Face, which is a veterans organization against U.S. war and imperialism, about sort of the mechanisms of the coup, about the right-wing coup plotters. So that'll be something to tune in next week. I would like to focus more on sort of the economic motivations, I think, behind the coup plotters. What is it in terms of Bolivia's social structure under Morales that the essentially coup plotters hope to reverse? Like, what is it that Morales and the MAS were able to put into place that the coup plotters are so violently against?
Yeah, Morales said it best when he said, my sin is I'm indigenous, and my sin is that I'm anti-imperialist. And what Evo Morales and the MAS leadership and government has done since 2006 is they've had the audacity to say that the resources of the Bolivian people belong to the Bolivian people, and that the nationalization of these resources, using them for the collective good, instead of for the exclusive gas executives like the Carlos Mesas and the Fernando Camachos. And that's, again, this was Morales' sin or crime. And we now see Bolivia now is aligning itself with Brazil and Bolsonaro, another neoliberal right-wing government. Argentina is in flux, of course, with Alberto Fernandez, who just welcomed Evo Morales from his Mexican exile. He's now in Argentinian exile, along with Rafael Correa, the former president in Ecuador. So we see Bolivia swinging all the way to the right in the Latin American scene and the international scene. The MAS announced today that David Choquehuanca, who's the secretary of ALBA, and Andrónico Rodriguez, they will be the presidential and vice presidential candidates in the upcoming elections, because Áñez and the golpistas, the coup leaders, have said that, and they have no legal right to do this, that Morales, the most loved, politician and leader in Bolivia, no longer has a right to run. So the MAS has had to reorganize themselves amidst this new reality. In terms of the economic component, you just had a mass organization of Bolivian society, all these different social programs, historical reparations for the indigenous, the use of the Waipala flag, linguistic rights, social investment in housing programs and medical programs. There were hundreds of Cuban doctors who were working there voluntarily, and they were kicked out by the right-wing government. And that's one of the first things they tried to do in the 2002 failed coup in Venezuela. They went to the Cuban embassy in Caracas and harassed and viciously attacked all of the Cubans who were stationed there in Caracas. So it's just so interesting. The first thing that these right-wing coup governments do is go after Cuba. And of course, imperialism has never forgiven Cuba, and that's why Cuba's been blockaded since 1959. Because Cuba was that shining star. That's the watershed moment for Bolivia, for Venezuela, for all of the Western Hemisphere and the Caribbean, and really the entire quote-unquote third world or all oppressed countries. Cuba proved January 1st, 1959, that yes, it can be done. David can take on Goliath. And Bolivia was another historical example where for the past 13 years, there's been incredible progress, and really people from around the world, oppressed people, look to Bolivia as an example on the environmental front, on the economic empowerment front, for historical reparations. And, but they built, the military question is a very important question, because here we see a key difference between Venezuela and Bolivia, because as we know, the U.S. has waged an unceasing war against Venezuela, an economic war, a military war, a media war, a diplomatic war. But somehow, some way, the people of the 30 million people, including the diaspora of Venezuela, has held strong. In large part, too, that's because of a loyal military, a loyal state. But we saw in Bolivia how quick the police and the military were to tear out the Waipala, to shoot upon their own people in the very neighborhoods where they often come from. So the military question was something that needs to be looked at closely in terms of why Bolivia swung over to the right so quick.
the key difference, I think, with the Venezuelan military, there's the actual kind of changes that Chavez made in the early days of his presidency to the military, which was to remove many of the coup plotters that attacked that country in 2002. Nonetheless, even some of the same coup plotters in 2002 have still been active to this day in Venezuela, but their power within the military has been greatly dwindled. Part of that is also because the Venezuelan military, even going back to pre-Chavista days, has a more kind of proletarian or Bolivarian, I guess, component. There are some interesting interviews from Chavez himself as to his time initially in the military and some of the education he got there that really differentiate it from the militaries of many comprador governments. There is, of course, that question of how does a government that hopes to make these gains for the people, as the Morales administration did, as the MAS did in Bolivia, how do they deal with that question of the military, which is often, as part of the state, loyal to capitalist forces that may supersede their technical control by the civilian government. And I think we're even seeing that to some degree within the United States with regard to the FBI and the Trump administration. I don't want to get into too much, but I think it's important to recognize this difference between a civilian government and the state. The civilian government being elected, being more kind of accountable to some degree to their constituents versus the state, which is largely unelected, whether you're talking about police officials, whether you're talking about military officials. They're appointed, not elected. They serve careers rather than having to be up for re-election every few years. And so you see these kind of deeper loyalties to a more cohesive capitalist project within the state than you do.
Yeah, a lot of opportunism and careerism. And I'm glad you made these points, because MAS, they built an anti-imperialist military school with this Bolivarian vision, this new orientation to try to get away from the police chiefs like Calderon, Vladimir Calderon. He was and William Calaman. These were military attaches to the U.S. They were trained in the U.S. So these commander of the Bolivian armed forces were very opportunists. They were waiting. They were snakes in the grass, waiting for this opportunity. So Bolivia, I think, made that effort. But, that's the thing with revolutions. When you go halfway with it, when the old ruling class, is still in power in many different ways, it's very risky. Like, even in Venezuela, you still have an Altamira in Country Club. These are the rich neighborhoods in Caracas. Caracas is a very divided, segregated by class, by race city because of the legacy of colonialism. So as much as we admire and follow the Bolivarian revolution, it has a long way to go. I mean, as in the words of Mao Zedong, revolution is no tea party.
Oh, yeah, without a doubt. I look at the comparison not in terms of saying which one's better, which one's worse, which one but just to sort of understand the range of experiences, because to me, the whole pink tide experiment is something truly unique in kind of the history of socialist building. As I've mentioned before, there's nowhere else where socialist governments have been able to take power through this electoral means in this way. You have governments that have called themselves socialist, like democratic socialists or whatnot, or social democracies in Europe, but these generally tend to be like sort of capitalist governments with some like welfare state window dressing. In Latin America, there's been something much, much different, which is to say that these governments have come to power through an electoral means, and they found themselves kind of sitting at the head of a capitalist state that abhors their very existence. And so, part of the experiment is you need enough kind of trial runs. You need kind of that wealth of experience. You need to be kind of building that in such a way, and that experience that comes from Bolivia versus Venezuela, and looking at the other countries in the region, how they've struggled with the same thing. For instance, how Correa in Ecuador was betrayed by Lenin Moreno. It's truly kind of a learning experience. And sure, those of us in the U.S. can look and say, oh, this government did this wrong. They should have been more to the left here. They should have been less quote unquote authoritarian there. That's not a framing I would use, but it's a framing some people use. Like, it's so easy for people to make those kind of criticisms from afar, but it's such a, I think, complex situation on the ground. And there's so much that's still being kind of learned about how to manage these contradictions that it's much harder to really kind of do that when you're kind of in the thick of it.
That's such a great point because, you go to Venezuela and you could be broke in the U.S., but suddenly your dollar, $1 is worth 40,000 bolivares. That's what it was last week when I was in Venezuela. At this point, it's probably 42, 43,000 because they have an internal sabotage mechanism, never mind all the pressure from outside. Citgo and all of the Venezuelan refineries being seized here in the U.S. and the distribution at the gas stations. And that's, it puts so much pressure on any of these revolutionary governments who dared to stand up to U.S. imperialism.
I'd like to also talk about something that, with regard to like what it is that Bolivia has done that should truly be an inspiration. The Morales administration moved to essentially make Bolivia a plurinational state. I don't even think have a concept for what it is that means, because we're so tied to this idea of the state and the nation and the country meaning the same thing. That this idea that like a state could represent the interests of all of these kind of nations within it is something that I think is completely foreign to us. To us, like a state is almost like an ethno-state by default, whether Americans will admit that or not. Kind of the U.S. is essentially built on a white supremacist model, whereas like this idea of kind of a true multinational state, a true society that is built around the needs of all the nations within it. That's something that I think has generally been unique to Bolivia. I don't even think Venezuela has gone that far, even though they've recognized indigenous rights in many very, very important ways. That plurinational concept is something that was truly unique, or has been truly unique to Bolivia.
Oh, no question. A plurinational secular state recognizing all languages, all nationalities, increased sovereignty over land and resources, the redistribution of the Bolivian wealth, of course, lithium, which is the main component in the smartphone revolution, what some call the gold of the 21st century. There's about anywhere between 30 to 45% of the world's lithium reserves are in Bolivia. The promotion and inclusion of all indigenous languages, reparations in the form of the creation of permanent seats for indigenous leadership. So we saw gains in so many different ways. And this idea of different nations, like you said, within one country, of course, in the United States, the question of Black liberation, Puerto Rican liberation, Chicano liberation, Aztlan, all the indigenous nations who today continue to be oppressed in every sense of the word. The educational system is a miseducational system in Black and brown communities. And, what respect has there been for indigenous languages and culture and the holidays that are really hell days that are celebrated from Columbus Day to Thanksgiving or Thanksgiving. So you had a completely new reorientation towards all these historical questions, from the educational system, incredible gains with progressive media and people's media. I just came back from el Congreso Internacional de Comunicadores Sociales and International Congress of Social Communicators in Caracas, and to build with the Bolivian representatives. These were the things that they talked about for the first time in this 500-year history. 500-year colonial history of Bolivia, the Quechua people, the Aymara people, the other indigenous nations were empowered to take their destiny back into their own hands.
I also want to bring up that question of lithium. I think Americans, when they see this sort of thing and understand that Bolivia is home to, as we talked about, 35 to 40% of the world's lithium supply at a time when the world is being increasingly pressured to move to quote unquote renewable energy, which means different things to different people and different corporations. But nonetheless, lithium then becomes a very valuable commodity. And of course, with Bolivia being a left-wing government that was empowered and nationalized its own resources and put that wealth generally toward the good of the people, generally toward like the development of communities and to bring people out of impoverishment. That does not, of course, gel well with the multinational corporations such as Tesla. I believe that Tesla's stock shot up just days after the coup. As with Iraq was called a war for oil, is this a war for lithium, or are there other kind of more complex situations there? Are there other kind of natural resources that the U.S. has its eyes on, or are there other gains that the U.S. really is trying in particular to roll back other than just generally rolling back social and political gains?
Yeah, very important question. I think it's important to go back to the definition, the scientific, historical definition of imperialism. Imperialism is the control of markets, the control of natural resources, the export of capital, as well as the role of the banks vertically controlling entire economies. And those four criteria constitute the definition of imperialism according to Lenin's 1915 work. And that's exactly what it is. When a Bolivia or an Iraq or a Syria or a Libya or a DPRK, North Korea, Venezuela, Cuba, Zimbabwe is the Venezuela of Africa, if you will. When any of these countries break away, if not entirely, like in the case of Cuba, to the extent that it's possible in 2019 in a unipolar world, right? But these other countries haven't completely broken away, but to the extent that they've broken away, they've been punished. So I think what an American audience should do is look at every country that's sanctioned, every country that's blockaded, every country that's been invaded and occupied. And of course, it comes under the guise of some humanitarian invasion because Gaddafi is so horrible, and Saddam Hussein and the Serbian leader Milosevic, and and they all have their face on the front of Time magazine and Newsweek because they're the devil incarnate, and it's the same blueprint and it's the same script. And I was just writing for Anti-Conquista, a wonderful popular publication across the U.S., and it's like, we can't be the same pendejos, the same fools or idiots to fall for these scripts of regime change. And regime change is just doublespeak, synonymous with recolonization. The countries who are beginning or have a decades-long process of decolonization, this is an attempt now in this unipolar reality. There's no longer a Soviet Union, though. We see China and Russia and how much fear the U.S. ruling class has of those countries because they refuse to play ball the way that a Boris Yeltsin was a puppet of the U.S., completely controlled, and they opened up what was the Soviet Union to U.S. capital. That's why they have to demonize the Putins and the Castros and the Chavezes, Maduro, Evo Morales, and the leaders that they can't control.
There's such a range of different kind of economic projects and social projects going on in the different governments you just mentioned. But I also think to some degree the era, this is not some like theory I'm coming up with today for sure, but the era of U.S. Unipolar domination is to some degree coming to an end, and it needs to come to an end. To those people out there who still think that the U.S. Can or should be the world police, they can just look at the absolute disasters, the millions of people, millions of predominantly black and brown people who have been killed since the beginning of U.S. unipolar unipolar domination, the multiple wars in the Middle East, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, the destruction of Syria, all of this is part of the U.S. unipolar domination, these major genocides that have happened across the world, the right-wing coups across Latin America, the failed state of Libya, where people are now being sold into slavery in the street, where parts of Libya are ruled by essentially warlords. And it went from essentially the country with the highest standard of living in Africa to one of the lowest. Like these are all projects that were part of the U.S. unipolar domination. There's no separating the U.S. as the quote unquote world police from these absolute humanitarian catastrophes. And one of the ways that the U.S. has been able to carry that out is through these illegal sanctions. I will mention that they're illegal sanctions every time they come up, because the sanctions that the U.S. imposes on Venezuela or on Nicaragua, the NICA Act, these are illegal by international law. And yet, because the U.S. is such a gangster state, the U.S. is able to simply do these things and pretend they're humanitarian and remain unchallenged. But that is, I think, authoritatively over, at least at this particular point, because, I mean, first of all, the coup in Bolivia, going back to our original subject, the coup in Bolivia is barely able to consolidate itself at this point. We're speaking in December 2019. The Venezuelan economy appears to be on the road to recovery, despite the fact that U.S. sanctions killed 40,000 Venezuelans. The Venezuelan oil production, hit a record high this year. Russia is able to step in, again, whatever the contradictions within Russian society, within Russian economics, Russia has stepped in to provide Venezuela with insulin when the U.S. was denying insulin to the country through its blockade. And the real, I think, nail in the coffin of this U.S. unipolar world is the fact that China, for the first time in my knowledge, any country has done this. China imposed a round of sanctions onto the U.S. So using its own strategy against it, because the U.S. economy is no longer so dominant throughout the world in order to enable that sort of essentially gangster behavior. So China having passed sanctions against the U.S. for its interference, for the U.S. interference in Hong Kong, I think represents a new era. Of course, it remains to be seen where this era goes. There are so many contradictions within the countries we're talking about that will resolve themselves in one way or another. But I feel like there is something on the horizon that's definitely shaking up world politics. And that's why we're seeing this essentially increasing demonization of state enemies. The fact that both of our major political parties are calling each other foreign communists and blaming Russia and China for everything wrong in so-called quote unquote U.S. democracy. Like there does seem to be something on the horizon for sure.
Great points for the listeners. And today is the 30th anniversary of the U.S. Christmas invasion of Panama. And to this day, the total dead have not been counted of how many people were killed from the U.S. bombing and occupation of Panama. A very cruel war in 1989 that a lot of Americans never knew about or forgot about. They should watch the Panama Deception if they can. And that was maybe the zenith as the Soviet Union imploded internally and no longer was. That was the zenith of unipolarity. But you just made so many points, such important points about the multipolarity that exists. And that's why they fear in Iran. It has nothing to do with Islamic fundamentalism or whatever buzzword of the day. It's that they don't control the 80 million people and the vast resources, the country in the world with the third most gas and oil reserves, Iran. And that's what all these different countries have in common that you mentioned, that because they're outside of the sphere of influence of the U.S. and they're not under imperial control, this deteriorating U.S. ruling class is very, very afraid.
We're going to go ahead and wrap up there. We were joined by Danny Shaw, who is a professor of Latin American Caribbean Studies at the City University of New York. Thank you very much, Danny, for joining the show.
Thank you, an honor.
That's all we have for this week. You have been listening to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. People's Republic originates in Austin, Texas, and is also available as a podcast on Spotify, Spreaker, Stitcher, iTunes, or wherever podcasts are podded. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at People's Radio ATX for more news and analysis. We are out of here.